Office 365 is the successor to Microsoft's Business Productivity Online Suite, or BPOS. BPOS was built around Exchange and SharePoint 2007. Office 365 officially launched in the summer of 2011 based on Exchange and SharePoint 2010, and it's been continuously upgraded to keep pace with Microsoft's Server and Office platforms. Microsoft's online Office suite market share tripled in 2015, putting it decisively ahead of Google Apps for the first time. Most analysts attribute this to Microsoft's aggressive pricing and their effective customer support. As of March 2016, Microsoft claims to have over 60 million active monthly user accounts. If you've seen the pricing for Office 365 and you do the math, we're talking about some serious revenue. Microsoft may have stumbled a few times in recent years, but they're not going to go bankrupt anytime soon. In fact, the larger the company in terms of annual revenue, the more likely they are to choose Office 365 over Google Apps when moving to the cloud. Above $10 billion in annual revenue, they're about 5 times more likely to go with Microsoft. Office 365 has many different subscription plans, beginning with Office Online and Personal and going up to Enterprise. At the enterprise level, you get all of the Office applications, hosted Exchange, hosted SharePoint, Skype for Business, OneDrive for Business, and so on. Most Faxination customers use our native Microsoft Exchange integration in some way. Typically, a foreign connector is created within Exchange that is associated with the fax address space. The actual communication is through drop folders in both directions. We monitor a folder for outbound messages, and we place messages and notifications going inbound to Exchange into a separate folder that Exchange monitors. There is no protocol involved in the traditional sense, which is much better than MAPI in the old days. SharePoint integration allows incoming Faxination messages to be routed to SharePoint document libraries. As we saw earlier in the training, it's also possible to write the Faxination log to a SharePoint custom list if you wish to do that. SharePoint communication is essentially standard web services, a URL, and Active Directory authentication. Office 365's hosted Exchange is multi-tenant and does not support the use of foreign connectors, so our Faxination MS Exchange connector cannot be used. The good news for us is that SharePoint Online is still just a URL, the same as it would be for on-premise, so we can use our standard Faxination SharePoint connector. However, Office 365 authentication is a bit more complicated than on-premise SharePoint, so we need to explicitly define the authentication method that we use in the SharePoint connector configurator. The Faxination SMTP stack is a server-level service that is installed automatically with Faxination 2016. Prior to Faxination 2010, SMTP communications were handled by an optional host component called the Universal Mail Connector. The SMTP stack is configured using send and receive connectors, very similar to Microsoft Exchange. And it can be used for both inbound and outbound fax and mobile messaging with any SMTP-compliant mail system or application. Sending outbound Faxination messages from Office 365 is different compared to Exchange on-premise and our Faxination Exchange connector. Instead of the bracket fax : number bracket format that's used to indicate an address space and a foreign connector in Exchange on-premise, now we have to use standard SMTP addressing along with DNS rules to get the message to Faxination using the standard SMTP port 25. Just think of this as setting up Faxination as a mail server for a specific subdomain, and that subdomain resolves via DNS to the IP address of Faxination. For inbound to Office 365, there's really nothing special. The Faxination kernel will match the routing codes or other criteria of an inbound message and package it up for inbound SMTP delivery. Also, because of our HTML-based presentation templates, an inbound SMTP message should look exactly like an inbound Exchange message to the end user. Even if your organization has been using Faxination for a while, they shouldn't notice any difference. Outbound from Office 365 in detail. A message is sent from the desktop or device via Outlook or OWA or some other SMTP client using standard SMTP addressing. Fax number at fax.contoso.com in our example. The Office 365 mail server does a DNS lookup to match fax.contoso.com to an IP address, which should ultimately lead to the Faxination server. We'll talk more on this in a few minutes. The Faxination SMTP stack validates the sending mail server, and if the domain name has an IPv4 or IPv6 address record, that can be resolved to the sender's email domain. After we have validated the sending mail server, we then use the same techniques to validate the sending user. This is all about blocking spam messages at the transport level. Once the sender has been validated, the message is then passed from the SMTP stack to the Faxination kernel. The user permissions are checked, document conversion is performed, and the message is passed to the transport device. We do recommend the use of an SMTP Edge transport server rather than exposing the Faxination server directly to the Internet. Faxination includes many security features such as connector contracts, IP filtering, SSL encryption, etc., but it's really designed to exist on your side of the firewall. It hasn't been hardened for potential Internet threats such as DDoS attacks. The SMTP Edge transport could be an appliance, an Exchange server with the Edge transport role, or a Linux box running open source software. Surprisingly, the Edge transport role was missing from Exchange 2013, but returned for Exchange 2013 SP1 and is also available in Exchange 2016. Whether you use Exchange or some other SMTP relay, they all work in essentially the same way. Office 365 Inbound, as we said before, is essentially the same as it would be for on-premise email. First, we match the routing digits that we received from the telephony system to a Faxination user in Active Directory. Faxination performs a DNS query to determine the IP address of the mail server that's responsible for the user. Faxination builds the SMTP message with the transmission information as the message body and the message or payload as the file attachment. An HTML template is used by default to standardize the message display on the email client. And then it's just a standard email delivered to the responsible server via SMTP port 25. To change from Active Directory Exchange to Active Directory SMTP, we need to edit two registry keys for the Active Directory data source. This is located in HKey Local Machine, Software, Fenestre, Extended Directory Object, 1.0, Parameters, Data. Find your LDAP source, which is DC01 in this example, open the attribute map key, and change address equals distinguished name to address equals email, and address type equals EX to address type equals SMTP. It's important that the word mail be in all lowercase without quotes. SMTP must be in uppercase with double quotes. This procedure is detailed in an FAQ on our support site, or you can contact Fenestre support for assistance. Here's a little more detail about the Sender Policy Framework, or SPF. It's an email validation system designed to block email spam that utilizes spoofing. In other words, pretending to be an email sender that you're not. SPF is a function of DNS. That's where the records are created and stored. As long as the sender's domain is authorized to use the mail system, the message is accepted. If the sender's from address domain has no SPF association with the mail system, the message is blocked and rejected as spam. You can learn more about SPF on the spfwizard.net website. Fenestre has no affiliation with the site or its owners, but there's some good information there and it's an easy URL to remember. Also, to maximize compatibility, keep your SPF records restricted to one line. Faxination may have difficulty with multi-line SPF records, and it's best practice to restrict them to a single line anyway when possible. And finally, be sure to configure the Faxination SMTP stack to only accept messages coming from your own SMTP domain. At Fenestre, we've always taken pride in the fact that our solutions do not require client software. That means our solutions take a few hours to set up in small environments, and maybe a day or two in large environments. There's no software to roll out to the workstations, and there's minimal training required for the end users. The downside to this approach is that we're pretty much at the mercy of Microsoft. Whenever they change something or break something, our call center and our developers get to work overtime. Moving from on-premise Exchange to Office 365 hosted Exchange not only changes how you address an outbound fax, but it also breaks any business fax contacts you might have in your Outlook address book. We didn't create these technologies, so we basically have no control over them. Instead of bracket fax : fax number bracket, after moving to Office 365, the format becomes fax number @ fax domain. And that's probably the hardest part of migrating to Office 365, teaching your end users how to fax again.